It's a great honor to welcome Professor Shephard. He teaches biology at Ave Maria University in Florida. I've had the pleasure of speaking to numerous teaching staff from Ave Maria, and you happen to be the latest. So, welcome, Sam, to the program.
Thank you very much, John.
So, we have two items on the table to discuss. One, that you have a recent paper that you co-authored that was published on the 3rd of July of this year, is titled Recreational Killing of Wild Animals Can Foster Environmental Stewardship. You've graciously sent it to me, and you've said that is something that you'd like to discuss. So let's begin with what is the general outline of the paper?
Yeah, the basic idea is it brings together some things I've been thinking about recently concerning environmental stewardship, and it tries to address the question of who will be the best steward of a particular natural place. And the idea is that that will be the person who's most profoundly embedded and intricately linked with that ecosystem. And the way to achieve that embedding is through outdoor practices like hunting and fishing.
Wonderful. Yeah, and you happen to be living in Florida right now, and regardless of the hurricane, I hear that the natural landscape of Florida is quite unique. You have the Everglades and everything. So how's being close to that side of nature help you with the
Yeah, I find well, we've been here. I'm from Scotland, from the north of Scotland, and I've lived in Ireland for a long time. We moved here 2 years ago, and it's been a kind
Mhm.
of ecological culture shock for me. Really, it's just so incredibly different here. It is beautiful, but it's a different beauty, and it takes a while to refocus, I think, and understand what it's really like.
I see. Yeah. I'd like to quote from the paper, if I may. Um, it says, we present this perspective for hunting and fishing in the Western world because embedded nature through sustainable practices and values has mainly been attributed to indigenous communities. By contrast, harvesting of wild animal populations in Western developed societies is often seen as guided by rational principles based on a utilitarian mindset that separates nature and humans. We counter this dualist perspective by recognizing that environmental virtue is psychologically constituted by sensory experience, emotions, and knowledge, and it is expressed through habituated practical skills which engage the body and the mind, and which happen to all people that interact consumptively with wildlife. So, with that said, how should we, as stewards of the environment, view the practice of mass uh, livestock production?
Hmm. Yeah, good. So that's one of the things we talk about in the paper, and it is very significant. So the starting point here, I think, is that there is an almost inevitable tendency in the way we eat, buying our food from supermarkets, particularly meat, to disassociate ourselves from where it comes from. There's nothing you can do about it, really. You go to the supermarket and you buy the small pink square of protein, but you don't know anything about it, and you certainly have no link to the animal that it came from. Part of our argument is that by hunting and fishing and by going out into nature and learning enough about your natural system to actually be successful, you develop a connection, a kind of authentic understanding of where the food comes from and a greater appreciation of the fact that you're integrated into the natural environment. And you are a predator and you're embedded in the system, but also and subsequently you set apart to some extent by your intellect and will and with the capacity to look after that system. And that's the foundation of stewardship. So it's about partly knowing where your food comes from and taking responsibility for that.
Just to relay from personal experience, when I was a kid, I used to live in Vietnam. That's the country where I was born and raised. And instead of going to the supermarket, we'll go to the market, or yeah, the outdoor
Mm.
market. And I would go with my mom, and we would buy either chicken or fish. This does not apply to pork or beef because I suppose the animals are too big. But when we do buy a chicken or a fish, we buy them fresh. So the butcher, so to speak, or the fish monger or the fish salesman would take the live chicken or fish, and he or she would process it right in front of our eyes. So you
Mm.
take a live chicken and you make it not alive anymore, and And that's something that I remember almost viscerally, and I can still remember it to this day. And I wonder to what extent can that be helpful to say my or anyone who has witnessed that with their
Yeah.
perspective on the
Well, how do you feel about it? You say you remember it viscerally. What do you mean by that?
I suppose it was not a pleasant feeling at that time,
Yeah.
of course, but I guess the more I remember the more I remember it, the more I sort of realized that something has to die for me to have good chicken or fish.
Yeah, and it's probably better to participate in that and recognize it and take responsibility for it rather than be sheltered from it. I mean, this is not a particularly original thought, but we're so desperately sheltered, aren't we, in our current lifestyle? And you really notice it living in Florida. You live in an air conditioned house and you buy your food from the supermarket and you drive from one safe place to the next. It's unbelievably detached from nature. And you could manage to get away with that, really, as long as nothing breaks, like it's just all broken in the hurricane. I think the closer you can get, given the constraints of the way you live, to the sources of your food and the ecosystems they come from, is probably beneficial. Yeah. And that visceral recognition of death, and like you say, the transformation of a living animal into dead meat and then into food. There's something very significant about that. I think there's something really significant about that kill as well. I talked a moment ago about embedding in your natural system. Part of the point of that paper and our other thinking on stewardship is that when you kill something to eat it, that's a threshold experience which helps you sink into the system and become more profoundly embedded. And from that embedding comes care and responsibility and stewardship action.
Now, before I became a Christian, which is 2 years ago when I was officially baptized in the Catholic Church back in Hanoi, my family, or at least my mom, when she'd see that, she certainly saw that I was deeply, profoundly altered by it, and she would say something like, "Well, since we believe in a form of reincarnation, when you sacrifice the body of an animal, then you would liberate its soul so that it can be reincarnated into a different life, perhaps a better life than that of, say, a
Hmm.
chicken or a fish." Um, I suppose it provided comfort to me for at least some time, but I guess when I reach my teenage years and I flirted for way too long with atheism, I thought that, well, when you die, that's it. And of course, I discovered that the Christian idea of the afterlife. So, how do we as Catholics perceive and contemplate mortality, the fact that life on earth ends?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'd love to be able to refer you. I'm writing a book at the moment with a guy called Adam Van Wart. He's a professor here at Ave Maria University, a theologian, and we're writing about hunting and fishing, stewardship, and so on. And I'm thinking from the perspective of sustainability science, and he from a much more theological perspective. But he's been introducing me recently to the idea, and I'll represent it poorly, but the idea that the the goal of, or that rather than imagining that when we die, we're completely removed from the earth into this kind of abstract heaven, that what God intends is more like the fulfillment of our earthly being, and that humans are essentially made from the earth. We're grounded in the earth, and our responsibility or our eschatological end is a kind of fulfilled earth. So I know I get into dangerous territory because I'm not a theologian, but this seems much more satisfactory to me that it's not like we're here for a while, we make the best of it, and then it's all over and we get carried off to be angels in the sky. It's much more like there's actually real transcendent meaning in our earthiness and our groundedness and this system where we are now and where we play out our salvation as a creature among creatures.
Well, not to get too much into theology, but the temptation to be Gnostics is always something that exists. It
Yeah,
first existed among the actual capital G Gnostics, but these days we do get inklings of people, even like fellow Christians and fellow
yeah,
Catholics, who denigrates the body and in some way exalts the spirit to degrees that are disproportionate. And I think the idea of us having to rely on natural resources to to survive, and that includes the consuming of animal flesh, something that can lead to that Gnostic temptation. So I wonder, how would you dispel people from this line of
Mm.
thinking?
Yeah, I like that. And I think the answer is that we are profoundly embodied. And you see this now. Um, Or do you see the kind of opposite of this now, particularly in students, the way they're addicted to mobile telephones all the time, right? There, this digital rectangle mediates the whole of their encounter with reality. But when you take it away, and this is one of the things we do in our assignments here in the university, is compel them basically to go outside and spend some time without their phone and then reflect on it. And what's incredible is they realize very quickly that they're embodied, that their encounter with material reality is multisensory, and they can smell things and hear them and taste them and feel them. So we are, to a really meaningful extent, our body, and our integration or our encounter with God's creation is sensory, it's embodied. And that's really important. So you can't really recognize who you are and the significance of death and eating and participation in nature until you deny this Gnostic idea.
Mhm. Yes, and I think I can have such a visceral experience when it comes to my body whenever I feel really hot or really cold,
Hmm.
and when I'm not in an air-conditioned room, which during summers in Vietnam, that can be whenever you're outside and you're
Right.
profoundly aware that you're sweating and and you feel a tremendous sense of discomfort.
Yep. Same here in
Yeah.
Florida. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Getting muddy and wet and hot and miserable is part of it. Yeah. It's a good
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm. Now, yeah, you mentioned that you're from Scotland originally, and looking at your paper, I'm reminded of a debate that occurred in, I suppose, the United Kingdom broadly some years ago, where there's a law that banned fox hunting, if I'm
Right.
not mistaken. And I remember reading from the great Sir Roger Scruton, the philosopher, who sort of argued that, well, you're not just depriving people of a tradition, you are in some ways upending the balance of life, of the bios, by removing the human element from it. The
Yeah.
foxes may uh, breed and grow and become um, a harmful population of animals or something like that. So I wonder, where do you stand on this question then and
Mm.
now?
Yeah, yeah. My intuition is, and this is probably because I'm relatively traditionalist, is that fox hunting is quite a good thing. I'm not that convinced by the what you might call the conservation argument for hunting. That hunting's justified because it's a useful um, means of stabilizing natural systems by removing excess prey and so on. But the fact is that the British Isles, for example, have been seriously modified ecologically for thousands of years, and it's certainly the case now. We've killed off things like wolves and bison and other very large predators that it is necessary to have some sort of ongoing maintenance of predator prey dynamics. So I think that's probably not a bad point. And I would argue there's probably more humane ways of doing it or responsible ways of doing it than hunting. So I think perhaps the social cultural aspect of rural life, which fox hunting represents, might be more important. And that will be more convincing to me than the fact you kill a relatively few foxes, which you might do better by other means.
Mhm. To what extent do your views in that of Catholic stewardship of the environment aligns with that of, say, modern mainstream environmentalism, and to what extent are we diverging from them?
Yeah, good. I think the key issue here is differences in anthropology. It's completely, a really actually remarkably fundamental difference in our entire understanding of what it is to be human and what nature is and how we relate to each other and whether or not God exists and whether or not nature was made. So environmentalism is based on a purely materialistic construct in which humans are essentially a problem because we cause all of this environmental harm. So the kind of logical solution, and it is perfectly sensible, is just to remove the humans. So the outcome is things like population control and the institution of massive closed areas. So you say, right, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity wants to close 30% of the surface of the planet by 2030 to most human uses. And that makes sense, right? If humans are the problem, if humans are just one species among many, then that's a sensible solution. But the Catholic Church, and I think our intuition for a lot of us is that actually humans aren't just simply one material species among many. At the very least, we're set apart by our intellect and will and by our capacity to act consciously for what we conceive to be the good, the common good. But we're also set apart, we believe, by a transcendent spiritual nature as well. So our stewardship actions are going to differ from those of secular environmentalists in that we have to understand our own significance and our own dignity. So we're operating from within the system, but we're also set apart from it with this explicit responsibility to act justly and charitably.
To segue into, say, the question of animal rights activism and whether
Mm.
this view of Catholic environmental stewardship aligns or diverges from it. I'd like to mention the name Peter Singer, the Australian philosopher and noted animal rights
Yeah,
activist. He said that if we view humans as a special animal, then we would be committing the fallacy of speciesism, which sets us apart or sets us as superior
yeah.
beings from the rest of the animal kingdom. So, how can how can we counter this view, so to speak?
Yeah, I think Singer was struggling with quite a common problem, which is trying to find a metric by which you could set humans apart. And I think ultimately he decided that there could be a hierarchy of value in animals based on simple IQ, I think, intellectual capacity, such that a very intelligent pig would be more significant than a not so intelligent human, for example. And he was acting from there. And I think what we have to say is that I think we have to perhaps make an a priori assumption that because we're made in the image and likeness of God, we're more important. But I don't think that's even necessary, and that it's self-evident that we're the only animals, as I've said, that have intellect and will and this capacity to decide what's the right thing to do and then do it for the benefit of the environment. So maybe our starting point is where we are and what we can do about it, rather than trying to make up some sort of abstract decision about whether we're more valuable or not. I'm always slightly reluctant to invoke religious justifications a priori because it doesn't get you very far with lots of people.
Yes, I can certainly understand that. I'm in a university with many secular people, and
Right.
in many ways, despite my religious-based morality, you cannot just invoke um, religious grounds to
Right.
support
Yeah.
your arguments.
Yeah, I agree absolutely. Yeah, and I've worked obviously for a very long time among scientists, and I always it's surprising. I have to convince my students here in Ave Maria sometimes that secular environmentalist scientists generally are people of great integrity and of goodwill and very compassionate and strongly motivated to do the right thing. But yeah, certainly in those circumstances, you have to, and it's a good thing, you have to start from a position of rational and constructive argument. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. What followed, the religious truths followed from that. If your argument is convincing, then the inevitable trajectory towards God will, will appear. But yeah, it's not a good starting point.
I understand that there's been this long conflict in regards to the compatibility of science and religion, and by religion
Mm.
we mean Christianity. And I wonder, from your perspective, what of the Christian faith that well, not only is compatible with, but can propel scientific discovery?
Scientific discovery. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I like the idea that the universe is comprehensible and that it's shaped according to objective laws that come from the mind of God, such that it's parsimonious and elegant and perfectly made, and that we can find out how that functions, how it works, we talk about God's first book about creation representing um, a prior expression of who God is prior to the Holy Scriptures, the second book. So I love the idea that science can direct you towards reading that first book, the book of creation, and therefore finding out about the truth instilled in it, which is a reflection of who God is. That seems to me like a good direction.
Mhm. Yeah. And how would you answer to the argument that despite, say, a given order of the universe, there are
Mm.
certain things that are natural or are innate in animal behavior. Say, some animals eat their young, or some animals mate with more than one partner at a time that are off limits to humans.
Yeah, good. I think the point is that we're built on a biological framework, aren't we? We're an animal essentially up to some point. Um, but there comes a point where we have to adopt the fullness of what it is to be human, which means operating in accordance to the moral law, which is in our best interest, I think. And at that point, we're not just a function of our evolutionary history, we're also capable of making decisions about what's the right thing to do. It's an interesting overlap, isn't it, between the animal and the spiritual? Yeah. I'm sure you've had some good theological discussions about that.
Yes, and I certainly hope to have more of these
Yeah.
discussions. Um, Now, of course, the main source of conflict that secular scientists would point to, I guess, religious people and religious scientists, is the account of the Book of Genesis versus Darwin's theory of
Mm.
evolution. And as I was watching your course, you explained that, well, you these views are completely compatible with one another. And I'd like to hear your reasons why.
Yeah. I still struggle a bit with this, because I still haven't come up with a process of the creation of the human person which is fully satisfactory to me. So I believe, on one hand, that the mechanical process by which humans were assembled can be explained in evolutionary terms, and you could track that back. If there was a perfect fossil record or perfect genetic record, you'd be able to see how it happened. But I'm also absolutely convinced that God made us, as Genesis says, out of the earth, essentially, which is perfectly reasonable, given that we're material organisms. But the way that we get from, I don't know, a small furry creature up to a pre-human physical structure and then over the threshold into mind and body and spirit, yeah, I'm never quite sure. I don't see that there's any reason why they should be incompatible. Um, but I would love to have a more, I don't know, fulfilling, satisfactory, empirical understanding of how that works. What do you think?
Um, I guess I'm of the same boat as you in that I cannot come up with a proper theological justification to reconcile these two perspectives. But I could certainly concur with, I believe, Pope Benedict the XVI statement that evolution can explain a lot of things, but it cannot explain our moral purpose in the universe, as
Yeah,
well as our universal responsibilities as members of the human species.
yeah. So it doesn't introduce meaning, right? Yeah, it explains our physical structure and capacities, but it doesn't. Well, it can't by definition because that's not the remit of science. It can't explain why it matters and what it means. Yeah, we have to work together on moving forward on this one, I think.
Yes. I hope you have your answer on that soon enough. Yeah, going back to the question of animal rights, I understand that this view, at least, is derived from a more or less modern philosophical view that places rights at the center of the human good, so to speak.
Mm,
And there's the broader framework of human rights, but um, eventually there's the concepts of rights based on groups of or identity of uh, which member of a group that you're based uh, with, say, women's right or
mm.
civil rights and minority rights and such that, and of course, there the animal rights activists are now moving towards the realm of non-human animals. So,
Yeah,
what is in your belief a proper Catholic view of rights?
yeah. I think inevitably rights come with responsibilities in regard to the rights of different animals. At the point where we have the capacity to, or this God given role to take responsibility for the care of the earth and to work to till and care for this garden that God's made, that responsibility therefore comes to the rights of the role, but also the rights of who we are. Whereas, and also the extent to which we operate as individual persons. So when you think of the human race or of our own species, we deal with a population. We also have this unique dignity as individuals. So we have individual rights. Whereas animals and plants, the functional unit, I always think, is the population, such they're more or less interchangeable, or at least they're interchangeable with regard to their individuality. They're not interchangeable with regard to certain traits. So large females, for example, are biologically more significant because they're more likely to have more and healthier young, but they can be replaced by other individuals with the same trait values. So in that case, the population has integrity and value, but individuals don't. And as such, don't have the same rights as the humans, who both take responsibility and have individual and transcendent significance and meaning. So in as much as we can take responsibility and in as much as we are individually valuable, we have rights.
Yes, I'm reminded of this example in a book by Dr. Steven Pinker, and he says that well, imagine that you have a lion whose needs for survival is, well, consuming gazelles, and the gazelles' needs for survival is, well, not being eaten by a lion. And, well, how can you reconcile the right of a lion to, to survive by consuming, gazelle meat, and the gazelle's right to live uninterfered by the lion's predatory behavior?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. That assumes the lion has a right to eat deer, doesn't it? Yeah, and right, exactly. I think these rights aren't really meaningful if you're just essentially a node in a food web. Yeah.
But nevertheless, in modern developed countries, we do have laws that prohibit the abuse of animals. So, is
Mm.
that more of a rights realm for the animal or the responsibility realm for the humans?
I think it's a responsibility. We have a responsibility to deal to deal responsibly. I don't want to say humanely because they're not humane, but to deal with responsibility with those animals for which we have care, which we've been given to care for. Yeah, I think with being a human comes that with authority and responsibility, doesn't it? So when we're dealing with animals, we need to deal with them properly. That's not a right which necessarily emanates from the animal so much as our responsibility for it.
I remember distinctively in the book of Genesis where God creates Adam, and he gives Adam the right or the duty to
Hmm.
name all the animals in the Garden of Eden. So essentially, Adam was the first scientist, if you can base that definition of scientist on. And how do you, when you reflect on this part of Genesis, how do you assume the role of, well, Adam in creation and the subsequent children of Adam, which you and I are part of?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by that idea that he named the creatures, and as such, he was actually playing this creative role and specifying what they were almost. They were almost somewhat plastic, I think, before that, weren't they? And he specified their identity and they subsequently became that. I was listening to the reading the other day when he was talking about, I can't remember where the reading's from in Genesis, but talking about how Adam named the animals, but it turned out that none of them was satisfactory or adequate to be his partner. And then God made woman out of man, and she was this fulfillment and this company. It's not good for man to be alone. Yeah, so there is certainly meaningful relationship and meaningful interaction with other animals. But yeah, I'm always fascinated by that Adam's role, and then our subsequent role is more or less the same thing. I think is that Adam was given to care for this garden, to take responsibility for animals, and in some way actually participate in the salvation of the world by drawing them towards himself and elevating them to the fullness of their potential, such that they could be caught up in our own salvific process. And Eve was a participation in that. And so obviously everything's fallen now, and that whole dynamic is twisted, but I think our essential role has got to be the same, and we should be trying to redeem it as much as we can.
Yeah, of course, in the same book of Genesis, we have Noah, who
Mm.
who built the ark and rescued all the animals. I guess rendering him the first zookeeper. Um, and yeah, there were two questions when I first encountered that part of Genesis. One is, how does Noah and his family manage to, I guess, process of the waste that is dispensed by the animal?
I remember thinking that. Yeah.
That's one. And the second question is, how does Noah keep you know keep certain animals from eating all the other animals? Certainly, they have he has the survival of several species in his
Right.
hands. So with that said, yeah, tell me about this relationship that Noah has with the animals. How do you reflect on
Yeah.
that?
Good. Well, I like the example of Noah because it makes me think about what we were saying a little while ago about our eternal destination being something caught up with the earth. And remember then, God was disgusted with the way humans had gone astray. And he said, right, I'm going to clear the earth clean and and we're going to have Noah rescue some of these species and re-establish the ecosystem. Basically, he didn't say. We know at this point, God didn't say, "Right, that it's over. I'm not bothering with this Earth experiment. We'll just take Noah and his family up to heaven and give up," right? Because his eternal destination is some abstract heavenly place. No, God said, "You are intrinsically do with the earth." And so my second attempt is again going to be earthly, and it's going to involve you, the same species of person, and your animals. So I think that's really important because it plays back into Noah's role here. He was rescuing them as part of his stewardship role. He was given this terrible responsibility. um, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten what your second bit of question was. Can you remind me?
No, yeah, it's essentially about the relationship that Noah has with the animals and how we can, I suppose, emulate that in our own lives.
Yeah, yeah, it's good, isn't it? I was always troubled as well by the fact that for almost any species, two individuals isn't enough to reconstitute a population because you lose too much genetic diversity and so on. Yeah. Although interestingly, human population became incredibly small actually for quite a long period of our evolutionary history. Um, yeah, we have to take care of these species. We have to respect what they are and what's required to conserve them for their own intrinsic value, for the fact that they are part of what God made and they are valuable, but also because they're significant to who we are and they're the fulfillment of our responsibility as carers.
Yes. So continuing on the animal motive, I suppose. Um, for the first few years of my life, even as a non-Christian, when I hear of Jesus as the Lamb of God, I always associate the lamb with a creature that is, meek and mild and
Mm.
non-threatening and all that. But it was a year ago that I heard, I believe, a theological reading, I believe from Bishop Robert Barron, that totally changed my mind. He said that, well, by saying proclaiming himself the Lamb of God, he does not mean that he is this meek and non-threatening creature. He was invoking the Jewish legacy of sacrificing the lamb and implying that he will be the the sacrifice. And I suppose we can reflect on the practice of using animals as sacrifice, and thanks be to Christ, we don't have to do that anymore. And I wonder, why is it in the book of Exodus and Leviticus, God seemed to permit this form of tribute?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's what you were thinking because I was much the same for a long time. I was brought up as a Protestant, and I remember because of course the Protestant Church doesn't have this authentic sense of sacrifice, so they've resorted to I think your image. And so as a child, I was read little poems about how Jesus is meek and mild and he's like a lamb, and I think that's a bit pathetic. This little lamb type thing. And again, it wasn't until I became a Catholic when I was 23, and even later that I realized, oh right, he's the lamb because he's the sacrifice. He's the one that willingly is going to be killed to bleed for us. Yeah, which is much more convincing and actually exciting, isn't it? Yeah. So why did God let them sacrifice animals? I think perhaps it's to do with the visceral significance you're talking about. But fundamentally, partly because it's you're giving something that's really valuable, but secondly, there's something about the kill, isn't there? Something about actually taking responsibility for the actions of killing an animal and watching it bleed. And then it turns from a live animal to a dead animal, from a dead animal into food, and then you consume it. There's something absolutely that fulfills our primary nature as multi-sensorial animals, but also with this capacity to think about what we're doing and consider the moral implications. Yeah, maybe there's nothing more profound than that.
Now, recently I was reading bits and pieces of Pope Francis's encyclical, Laudato Si, which is, I think, the non-Catholic press would focus a lot on, his warnings about climate change. But one thing that they often overlook is that Pope Francis first warns that any attempt to reduce or annihilate human reproduction is not helpful but harmful to this pursuit of
Yeah,
protecting and stewarding the environment. But he also says that there's a certain sense of beauty that we can gain uh, from stewarding the environment, from even just approaching the environment too. So how can that be done?
yeah. The first comment's interesting because I remember when Laudato Si came out, I think it was Nature magazine, and this global leading scientific journal, actually published, I think, a series of 5 essays by really important um, people or scientists working in sustainability science and evolutionary ecology and so on, responding to Laudato Si. And most of them were really positive. But the thing they got caught on was exactly this, his refusal to condone contraception and abortion. And they kind of glossed over this. I remember one of them even said something like, Pope Francis seems to be quite a smart guy, but does he really believe this? So yeah, inevitably the Catholic Church can never get it right as far as secular sustainability is concerned. Um, but yeah, concerning beauty, I think this encounter, I've talked about stewardship. What's the prerequisites for stewardship, or how does stewardship develop in an individual? And I've said that the starting point is nature experiences, embedding in engaging fully with nature. And I think this experience of beauty in nature is a kind of spark that for a lot of people, and a lot of the students I see here, that's where they suddenly start thinking, no, I went outside and I had this experience of nature that somehow was actually transcendent. It was so beautiful and so multisensory and so exciting that it triggered in me some sense of wonder or of awe or of transcendent significance. And a lot follows from that. And actually, that was my own conversion experience as well, to some extent. I was always very concerned with environmental issues and very aware of the beauty of nature. And so I went through a kind of trajectory from that through pantheism and etc., to the Catholic Church eventually, which was the most satisfactory intellectual and spiritual solution. But yeah, I think beauty is a starting point, encounter and beauty with nature.
Of course, you cannot mention Pope Francis without mentioning Saint Francis of Assisi. He wrote a great number of wonderful poems and odes to nature. I'm thinking about the one where he writes about brother sun and sister moon.
Yeah,
And yeah, how would you reflect on Saint Francis, this intimacy that he has with the natural world around him?
I think he was prepared to look and see what's really there. And we're so bad at looking, aren't we? I think a lot of the time we walk through nature and it's just this kind of blur of green that goes past, and we don't really stop and recognize our embodiedness and the fact that we can listen and see and smell and touch. And I think Francis just stopped and he really focused on being where he was, but at the same time doing that in a prayerful way, which acknowledged that it's not just a sensory experience, but literally a spiritual experience. And so he was able to really be there and see what's happening and realize that he was part of it. He's not set apart. He's not a human walking through a landscape. He's a person actually embedded in the system himself. I've really become very convinced by the work of an anthropologist called Tim Ingold. I don't know if you've come across him, but he introduced this idea of the taskscape. So he was very unsatisfied with the idea of landscape, that humans walk through this kind of abstract platform, which is the landscape, which is constituted of resources they can use or reconstruct things from. And so his idea is that Instead, humans dwell, he said, in a taskscape we where this kind of human non-human reality is constituted or constructed out of human actions, repeated human communal actions, which um, which construct or which make reality on an ongoing basis. And I find that integration quite exciting in lots of different directions. And perhaps Pope Francis was dwelling, or not Pope Francis, but Saint Francis really experienced this dwelling, this participation in nature.
Yeah, and of course, being trapped in our daily lives, there are certain phenomena of nature that we often overlook, don't we? Like for example, during the fall, people just take it for granted that leaves turn brown and fall off
Mm.
trees. And yeah, and when we reflect on the our previous discussions on mortality and such, I suppose it can be our way of, partially, if not entirely, negating the fact that, our life on this earth and the lives of all living creatures is limited.
Yeah, perhaps. It's interesting. Well, certainly you think of the autumn mood and so on, don't you? You may be right. Yeah, I wonder. I think it's probably rather tangled cause and effect there, isn't it? We don't like it, and so we stop noticing, and we stop noticing it because we didn't like it. Um, I love the idea that over time, and if you stay in one place, you can start to anticipate the way the seasons are going to change, and the way that you can understand what's going to happen next, and which species will play their key role next in the series of events of the year. I find that really exciting. I love waiting for these things to happen and then seeing whether they do happen and when. Is it early or a bit late and why it might be? Yeah, but perhaps you're right. Pressing mortality.
Yeah, I remember when I was studying in Canada, I did my undergraduate studies there, and I first saw the maple leaves. I first arrived there during the fall, so I got to see the maple leaves turning, well, yellow and
Mm.
then red. And yeah, I certainly thought that was a very phenomenal experience. And that was before the snow, of course. But I always felt really nice whenever I step on those leaves and it makes a crunch sound.
Yeah,
Always sounds very satisfying to me.
yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I remember meeting someone who'd come from Southeast Asia as well, and she moved to North America. And I remember, and she arrived in the winter, and she was looking at the bare black trees and wondering if there'd been some sort of ecological disaster. They've got no leaves on them. And of course, it's the cycle of the seasons for the first time. And that really struck me that that your entire frame of natural existence could be so completely different. You wouldn't have any experience of the fall. Yeah.
Um, how can we as Catholics avoid the temptation of, I suppose, the good term for it is Gaiification of nature?
Yeah, yeah, good. I think in a way, the Gaiification is an abdication of responsibility. It's it would be lovely to think that the world was constructed in a kind of ecocentric mode and humans are just one animal, one rather disposable animal among many. And actually, what matters, the most important unit, is the whole planet, and to the extent that it's a kind of literally a functioning organism. But um, no, we have to take responsibility. I think we can't pretend that that's how it is. We've made a mess of things basically through our concupiscence, and now we need to do something about it.
Yeah. I don't know if you've been asked this question before, but what do you think of Elon Musk and the prospect of us going to Mars if life on Earth becomes too uninhabitable?
Yeah, right. I think that's just the next stage from contraception, isn't it? Basically, first you try and reduce the human population, then you try and exclude us from half the earth, and then you say, well, if all that doesn't work, then we'll just bail out and go somewhere else. It's the same. It's the same anthropology of humans just being a problem. Yeah, I don't believe it. I think recreational space travel is ridiculous as well. Lots of people are concerned about climate change, but then they're prepared to use the amount of carbon-based fuel that's required to pop them into space.
And of course, as Catholics, we are resolutely pro-life. And I think, like you, I certainly wishes that I can do more to, in some ways, advocate for human life against these growing trends that are very much antithetical to human life.
Yeah,
I remember there's a story, I think it was 1 or 2 years ago, that originated in Canada, where there's this crisis around people opting for, you know, end of life treatment or euthanasia, where
yeah,
the criteria for receiving that kind of treatment becomes looser and looser, to the point where someone is somewhat frustrated with life, despite the fact that he or she is healthy, can offer that treatment. So I wonder, to what extent can you pinpoint the source of this this frustration, or at least this desire to end mortality as quickly as possible?
yeah. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. I think and part of this is pertinent to our current discussion in that we've come to the point where lots of people are really convinced. Well, they're so terrified by environmental issues or what they perceive as really pressing and probably quite real global existential ecological threats that they really think that the world would be better off without them. And so lots of people have no children, for example, and lots of people make really radical decisions about how they're going to live, even if they're not particularly rationally based on the actual ecological impact. And I think that creates this underlying understanding you're not actually meaningful, and in fact, you might just be quite a negative thing. So at that point, there's always this implicit possibility that you may as well be better off killing yourselves. But I'm quite sure that's not all of it. Although it doesn't contribute, I think part of it is that, well, the most important part of it is we don't believe we're special anymore, do we? We don't believe that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and fundamentally, we don't believe that God loves us and that we're made. Pope Francis, when he's talking about stewardship, he says um, environmentalism is based on this idea that we're stewards of the environment, which is an entirely material construct, basically. But as soon as we switch our mindset and say that we're stewards of creation, the creation's made, God made it as his first book as part of his deliberate plan, then we get caught up in what Francis calls his loving plan for salvation. So then we have a role, we're precious, we're loved, and we're participating in this eschatological trajectory, which is profoundly meaningful. At that point, we have a justification and a purpose for living. People just don't. People don't have any purpose for life, perhaps.
This may be a very big question, but how should Catholics understand the concept of love?
Yeah, I didn't really have an answer to that until I was been married for quite a long time. And love is about self-sacrifice, isn't it? It's about giving yourself, and it's decision. I remember when I was, and my wife and I, Anna, we got married 25 years ago this year. And I remember during one of our pre-marriage classes, someone said to us, "Love is a decision." And I thought, I don't really understand that. Love is this romantic feeling. It's all of these wonderful things about bouncing through the mountains and throwing roses about the place. But love's a decision. But that's fundamentally what it is, isn't it? It's a decision to give yourself for the greater good of the other. And that's basically a daily self-sacrifice. So yes, love is what God is, and it's what God is on the cross, and that's what the Lamb of God is about. Yeah.
Yeah. Is the natural world an expression of God's love for us?
Undoubtedly. Yeah. No, come back to the idea of God's first book, in that God is just overflowing with love, and his love is creative, it's beautiful, it's imaginative, it's diverse and extraordinary. And I think creation just flows out of him as an expression of who he is and how he is. So yeah, he created us because he was so overflowing with love that that's just what happens. Things are made. I have a bunch of kids. It's the same phenomenon, maybe. Yeah.
I suppose a slight objection to it is that, well, we have almost half of the creation of nature that are designed, so to speak, to kill humans. Not only are there animals with sharp teeth, but there are plants where, if consumed, can kill you, and there are fungi that there are some that can give you like vivid illusions, but there are some that that can kill you. So how do you respond to this?
Yeah, life would be pretty boring if it was just completely safe, wouldn't it? Maybe it's just much more exciting. I suppose there's two bits that come to mind. First of all is life's much more interesting and exciting and fascinating if we exist in a diverse construct which has all of these complexities. Like poison is a really interesting thing, isn't it? The fact that some animals are deadly because they have this particular aspect of their behavior or their physiology. I think that's really cool. The other bit is it gives us the freedom to operate sensibly, to make decisions about what's the right thing to do, and to not just be uh, operating completely deterministically. And thirdly, I hate the idea of living in a completely safe world. You wouldn't be free, would you? If you would be like being in a mental hospital or something, completely protected. I don't think that's what God intended.
Yeah. Returning to the book of Genesis and the fall, of course, one of the consequences of the fall is that Adam and Eve are no longer allowed to live in Eden. And
Mm.
I wonder, is it because if they, in their fallen state, continue to reside in Eden, they would find ways to destroy it or make it in their own image, which will be worse than, you know, the Eden that was given to them.
Yeah, I think perhaps well, if they'd stayed in Eden, they had access to this, to the tree of life, didn't they? So they would live forever. And I think perhaps part of God's rescue plan was that we had to die so we could go back to Him. Yeah. So maybe it just wasn't any good anymore. Living forever is great if you're doing it right.
Yeah. I suppose would if there is a cure for mortality, would you or I or would many people accept it?
I'm sure they jump on it, wouldn't they? Lots of people are crying, preserving their
Yeah.
bodies for this future possibility of being resurrected. It sounds to me like an appalling idea.
Mhm.
I don't know. The older I get, the more thankful I am that human life is finite, and we just have to do the best of it for however many decades it is, and then that's enough. Yeah.
Going back to, I guess, your example of living in a completely safe environment, I'm reminded a lot of Robert Nozick and his thought experiment of the experience machine. And there's a survey that when uh, Nozick's first thought experiment was first proposed, and not many people would like to jump on the experience. But when you talk to college students today, a much higher percentage of them would like to engage in that experiment, perhaps in the long term. And well, first, I'd like to ask your thoughts on the experience machine, and secondly, why this increase in jumping to that experience.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this. Can you explain it a bit more? What was the
Okay.
experience?
So just briefly, so there, Nozick conjures up this thought experiment wherein there's is a machine and there will be a team of scientists that is responsible for, your daily feedings and hygienic practices. But basically, you as a person will experience life or whatever source of experience that you would like to have while being, say, strapped into a machine that can provide you
Hmm.
these experiences neurologically.
Okay, right. Virtual reality, basically. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And more young people will prefer the idea of something synthetic to what's real. Yeah, that's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, whereas, of course, you'd think that our objective would be to attain to to become as close to truth and reality as possible, not as far. Yeah, I find that a bit scary. Perhaps it's almost inevitable given our increasingly digital reality. But yeah, I think what I'm talking about embedding in nature, encountering nature, killing things, being out there, getting cut and hot and tired and miserable. Yeah, is exactly the counterpoint to that experiment. Yeah, I don't see how someone who lives a digital lifestyle or this kind of human experiment can possibly become a steward, for example.
Yes, of course, because he would not be doing anything much else either.
Yeah, doing anything at all. Yeah, yeah.
So, how does our special role as being made in God's image enables us to, I guess, be better stewards of the environment?
Yeah. So I think if you recognize that you are made in the image and likeness of God for some purpose, then that's the fundamental beginning of stewardship. So you're made for a role, you're made for a purpose, and now you can decide whether or not you're going to take up that role and accept the responsibility you've been given. So then you switch straight away from nature conservation for essentially utilitarian reasons, just because you don't want to saw off the branch you're sitting on with regard to natural goods, and you take responsibility for caring for nature because it's actually what's required of you, and it's this transcendent role that you have. So now you're caring partly for reasons of practical sustainability, but also because you're participating in this process of creation and salvation.
Now, returning to your paper, I wonder, is it a good idea to not only to include yourself in the activity of hunting and fishing, but also include, say, your children, and I guess children in general, as is the case with,
Mm.
say, the Boy Scouts? Would that be a good idea as well?
I think all of these things are good. Yeah. Anything which gets you out into reality and challenges you both by participation in complicated natural processes, but also I think particularly, and this is I think something I think about a lot, is particularly in learning challenging outdoor tasks. So we talk a lot about how it is that learning mentored outdoor practices like hunting and fishing or gardening or mountain climbing or anything like that is really formative, both with regard to nature experience and encounter, but also with regard to your own formation as a person. And then you touch on this Aristotelian mode of developing virtue by complex practices. So you develop muscle memory and intuition, practical wisdom, but also associated moral virtues. So yeah, there's a lot to this outdoor practice thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose going outdoors in just a local area environment is a much better way to experience nature than, say, watching a David Attenborough documentary.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of evidence those documentaries are almost useless for helping people actually become practical stewards. Yeah. They're either deeply disempowering because it all looks so disastrous, or they're just kind of nice and pretty, but they don't do anything else. Yeah. No, you get outside because stewardship works where you are. Stewardship's about caring for the place that you actually encounter. Yeah, it's very hard. I remember, so I was brought up in a little island in the northwest of Scotland, but I remember when I was 13 being terrified about the fate of the Amazonian rainforest, but at the same time, utterly powerless to do anything about it. It was just overwhelming. And I can understand the kind of ecological existential fear that many young people have now. Everything seems totally out with their control. Better to care for your own little patch, the patch that you know and that you love.
Yes, and I think this is where we can end on. There's certain correlation to, say, this macro view of nature versus this macro view of humanity. There are certain people of a more activistic sort who thinks of humanity in such a large scale, while, say, neglecting the obligation to treat the people close to them well. So I
Yeah,
suppose it's the same thing as those who care about the preservation of the Amazon rainforest while neglecting the nature that is outside their
yeah.
borders, for example.
Yeah, I think this comes back to what we were saying a minute ago, that animal populations do function more or less at the population level, but humans are individuals. Each one of us is unique and precious, and we should be dealing with the person in front of us and the place that we're in, not trying to think about these very high level and slightly abstract um, conservation or environmental issues. We've got to start with someone.
And it goes back to avoiding the temptation of narcissism, as it is.
Yeah, right. Yeah. You can touch one person, but you can't touch the human race. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, Professor Samuel
Yeah.
Shepherd,
Thank you
for
very
joining us.
much. Yeah, it's been lovely to talk to you. God bless. Bye bye.